All right, over the last few days, or even you could say the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about fire regimes, and especially fire regimes in California. So, when I say fire regime, that basically just means the typical fire that you see within an environment or an ecosystem or an area. And we're going to characterize those based on three different characteristics: temporal, spatial, and magnitude. Within temporal, you have, so that's like your time aspects. You're going to have seasonality, so when do fires usually burn in that area, and fire return interval, the difference in time between fires. For spatial, you have fire size, which is basically the fire perimeter, and then spatial complexity, which is talking about within that perimeter, you might have unburned areas, high severity burn, low severity burn, and the smaller those patches are, the higher the spatial complexity. And then finally, within magnitude, we have fire line intensity, which is the amount of energy or heat coming off of the front or the length of your flames. Fire severity, which is the impact the fire has on the environment, so the impact it has on vegetation in terms of plant mortality, or perhaps on human life and property. You could put that into the category of fire severity as well. And then the last one, number 7, it's under magnitude, and that's fire type. So do you usually see surface fires in this area, or do you have passive crown fires, active crown fires, or independent crown fires? Independent crown fires, that's going to be the rarest one. So that's how you break up fire regimes into its different, you could say, branches or characteristics. And then there's going to be different strategies to try to figure out, if you're looking at an area, how does it fall into all those different categories? So you're trying to figure out, when does fire usually burn in this area? What's the fire return interval? What kind of fires do we usually see? Are they large with high severity, or are they small and frequent with low severity? And you're going to have a number of different tools to try to figure that out. And those tools are going to be dependent on the time scale that you're looking at. So if you want to look very far back in time, your best bet is probably going to be sedimentary charcoal and pollen. With that, you can look back 21,000 years. But as you can imagine, that's going to be your least accurate. But it is pretty cool how it works. If you think about your landscape, fire comes through, burns parts of the area. It's not going to be complete combustion though, so there's going to be charcoal left over. And then when a rain comes in, it washes that charcoal down throughout your watershed into maybe a lake. And then that charcoal settles down to the lake bottom. You have a little charcoal layer. Next year, just some soil settles on top of that. The next year, maybe more soil. And if you were to take a core sample of that lake bed, you would have basically a timeline going back maybe, I think the furthest study that has gone back was 16,000 years. But I believe with the mass spectrometry and the radiocarbon dating, I think I finally said that word correctly this time. With that, we have the ability to look back 21,000 years using the various isotopes. I'm not going to get into the science behind that because I don't totally understand the science behind that. Maybe that's something I need to look into further. I believe it has to do with the fact that you have different isotopes that I'm pretty sure they decay, and by that I believe they lose their electrons or something. I'm trying to think back to chemistry like years ago, and based on how many electrons it's lost, then you're able to date how old that element is. Don't take my word on that. That's just, I believe, how that whole process works. But just getting back to it, you have your core sample, and within it you'd be able to see where those charcoal years happen. And that would give you an idea of when you had fires in the past and their relative fire frequency or their fire return interval. So maybe you see a charcoal layer, then there's 20 dirt layers, and then, or soil. My old soil science teachers would be mad if they heard me call it dirt. So 20 layers of soil, and then maybe another charcoal layer gives you a rough estimate of your fire return interval. But again, that one's not going to be as accurate. What is cool about that, though, is you can also coincide your charcoal with your pollen, and then you would know what kind of plants and vegetation were around in that time where you had the fires. So it gives you a little bit of that connection between the environment in terms of your vegetation and the environment in terms of fire. Notice I included fire within the environment because fire is not a disturber to the ecosystem. It's actually a part of the ecosystem, just the same as temperature or precipitation is. So that's sedimentary charcoal and pollen. The other one that I talked a lot about, and I think this is maybe the coolest one, is dendrochronology. Dendro meaning tree, I believe, somehow. And then chronology is like time, so chronological order. And the way you do that is you're looking at tree rings. You've probably noticed this if you look at a stump. You can count how old that tree is. And what's cool is that if a fire comes through that doesn't completely destroy the tree, what it will do is leave a little fire scar on that tree ring. And then this can be fairly accurate because you can count back in time, you see a little fire scar, and then you keep counting, maybe there's 10 more tree rings and you see another one. You have a pretty good idea of your fire return interval right there. And then what's also cool about that one is you can, while sedimentary charcoal and pollen, you have that little connection between vegetation and fire. With tree rings, you get a bit more of the combination of climate and fire because the width of your tree rings are going to depend on maybe the precipitation and the temperatures around that time. So maybe in times where there's like the medieval warm period, you see your fire frequency increase. And then during the Little Ice Age, you see your fire return interval get longer. So there's less fire. That one's pretty interesting. The other ones that we can use to look back in time could be more things like historical records, maybe some reports, some studies, usually from the timber industry who was trying to figure out what the resources were like in the forest. You have oral communication that's passed down, mostly through Native American stories. And then it even comes down to things like diaries. I've read one study that kind of the basis of our information going back in time was just something pulled out of a diary where this guy explained a crazy downslope wind event that happened, I don't know how long ago, maybe 100 years ago, that led to a pretty large wildfire. So those are some of the various things that we can use to look way back in time. But then what I was just reading about today in Fire in California's ecosystems is some of the strategies that we use to figure out our fire regimes in the current day. So this is going to be more contemporary. The big ones, or the biggest one that you've probably seen, are those fire perimeter maps. And these are fairly accurate these days. And they're usually pretty quick to put these fire perimeter maps out. Whenever I'm doing a wildfire forecast, I'll watch I think they're called incident reports, usually done by CAL FIRE or the U.S. Forest Service. And on it, they always have their perimeter map, and they're pointing to where the fire is burning, where they're putting in some containment lines, where they're hoping to stop the fire, that kind of stuff. But the key thing that we're looking at there in terms of fire regime would be that fire perimeter map. So that's going to be your fire size in those 7 factors that I talked about within fire regimes. Fire size was within your spatial characteristic. Now, one thing that's important to remember there is that just because you have the fire perimeter doesn't mean that everything within that perimeter has burned. That's where spatial complexity comes in. So if you just have maybe someone doing a hand-drawn map, it's possible that they overestimate how much is actually burned within that perimeter because not everything within that perimeter actually has burned. But then on the other side of things, if we're just using maybe aerial imagery or satellite imagery, it could potentially underestimate how much has burned within that perimeter, because if you have maybe a dense canopy and it wasn't a crown fire that went through the canopy, it might not be able to see that you had some surface fire down below. But maybe I should talk about the main ways that we come up with those fire perimeter maps. I already mentioned one. They could still be hand-drawn, but two of the main ways that we have those now is aerial imagery. So I believe they put infrared cameras on planes and then they fly over the fire. And I believe that's where most of the maps come from these days. At least the ones that I download and use in my wildfire forecast. Sometimes I won't have the current fire perimeter because they couldn't get a plane over the fire. That could be for a number of reasons. Maybe there was too much smoke, so it would have been pointless because they can't see like where the heat is on the fire. So too much smoke, maybe too many clouds, maybe there's some thunderstorms and they can't fly. But overall, I'd say they're pretty quick to get those fire perimeter maps out. And then the other one would be satellite imagery. And often in my wildfire forecasts, I'll actually look at the satellites and there's this one like little characteristic, that's the best word I could say, or one type of satellite band you can look at where it says fire. And you click on it and you can actually see like the glowing on the map. And it's coming from a satellite. And you're going to be able to see when that glow starts to get brighter. That's going to be when your fire is much more active. Usually that's more in the afternoon. And then usually at night you see it start to die down. But you could imagine that if you were to take a little time lapse of that light coming from the satellite where the fire shows it's burning, you would be able to have a pretty coarse resolution of where that fire has burned. And interestingly, you might be able to start to get into the categories of fire severity as well. So, fire perimeter, main things you're going to use, aerial imagery and satellite imagery. But then I just mentioned fire severity. So this is kind of getting more into spatial complexity a bit because, as I mentioned, it doesn't tell you everything you need to know if you just have your fire perimeter, because within that fire perimeter you might have an unburnt area, which you could call an island. You might have an area that completely burned with high severity. Severity is just, again, a way of saying the impact the fire has on the vegetation or life and property. And then you could have low severity. So for that, if you're mostly talking about vegetation, they use some kind of technique. It's called DNBR, Difference Normalized Burn Ratio, where they take a picture from before. This is at least how I understand it. As I read the chapter or the section in the chapter right here, and this is the best I understand what they're doing here. They take an old picture of that area, most likely from satellite, and then they take a picture after the fire, and then they compare the two, and somehow they're able to pick up on the chlorophyll, which is something that's within plants. I believe it plays a big role in photosynthesis. But based on the differences in chlorophyll, they can figure out where there was maybe high plant mortality, where there is maybe medium plant mortality, or just low severity fire. So you can imagine how that works. You have one picture, shows your vegetation before the fire. Have the next picture, maybe this tree is gone, maybe this patch of shrubs is gone, maybe this grass has been burnt out. And then you're able to see relative idea of the fire severity and the spatial complexity within that fire. Now, obviously, that's going to have some limitations as well. But overall, I think the main point I'm trying to put forward is that the tools that we have to figure out our fire regimes nowadays are much advanced to some of the tools that we used to figure out fire in the past, or the tools that we had in the past, in terms of characterizing the fire regime. So in the past, it was maybe a very coarse resolution of where the fire burned. I don't even know if we'd be able to figure out the exact fire severity that we had or the spatial complexity. And our tools just continue to advance more and more, which is great news, because the more we understand about wildfire in our environment, and the more we understand about what kind of fire regimes are in place across California, then the better we can manage that land and try to put practices in place that are actually good for that ecosystem given that specific fire regime. So for example, maybe there's an area that has frequent surface fires every 5 to 15 years. Well, since we know that based on a lot of these mapping tools that we have, then if there hasn't been a fire there in 30 years, that could be a good place to do some prescribed burning, clear out some of the fuels that have accumulated, most likely due to our fire suppression, and kind of return that environment back to its normal balance. But maybe there's a chaparral that's return interval should be 50 years, and we're starting to see too many fires popping up there. That's maybe an area where we should do as much fire suppression as possible to give that chaparral ecosystem time to build back up its seed bank, time to build up its reserves and its burrows underground. And that's why I've been talking so much about fire regimes recently. It's because in order to live with fire and kind of in balance with nature, you have to understand nature as well as you can. And throughout this chapter, it continually goes through the limitations, and understanding your limitations are always important. But at a certain point, we do have to take it as much information as we currently have and just do the best thing that we possibly can. But understanding wildfire in California is the first step to take on that journey to good land management. And I'm really just learning about this now, but hopefully one day I'll be able to start interviewing some experts who have been doing this their entire lives in their careers, because I'm sure I could learn a lot from them as well. Right now I'm kind of getting the condensed version within this book. So if you want to continue to get the condensed version as well, at least as condensed as I can make it through these videos, I usually end up going on some tangents, but try to keep them concise. If you want to learn more about wildfire in California, you can stay tuned, and thanks for watching.